The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the Miami-Dade County courthouse as 3-year-old Emma Rodriguez clutched her worn teddy bear, Mr. Buttons, with trembling fingers. The stuffed animal had been her constant companion. Since that terrible night 6 months ago, the night that stole her voice and shattered her family's world. Her tiny red dress, carefully chosen by her grandmother Rosa for this crucial day, seemed too bright against the somber gray walls of the imposing building that would decide her father's fate. Detective Maria Santos watched from the courthouse entrance as Emma's small legs struggled to climb each step, her patent leather shoes clicking against the cold stone. Santos had worked countless cases involving children over her 15-year career, but none had haunted her like this one. The little girl held the key to everything, the truth that could either condemn her father to 20 years in prison or set him free. Yet trauma had built an impenetrable wall around Emma's memories, leaving her voiceless when her family needed her words most desperately. "Mia, we're almost there," whispered Rosa Rodriguez, Emma's grandmother, her weathered hand gently guiding her granddaughter through the revolving doors. At 68, Rosa had raised 6 children of her own, but nothing had prepared her for caring for a traumatized toddler while watching her son face false accusations. Her arthritis ached in the courthouse's air conditioning, but she pushed through the pain, knowing Emma needed her strength today more than ever. Inside the courthouse, the familiar chaos of the American justice system buzzed around them. Lawyers in expensive suits hurried past carrying briefcases, their phones pressed to their ears as they discussed plea bargains and witness testimonies. Court clerks shuffled papers behind bulletproof glass, their faces showing the wear of processing. Human tragedies day after day. Emma pressed closer to her grandmother, overwhelmed by the noise and unfamiliar faces surrounding her. Detective Santos approached them carefully, crouching down to Emma's eye level. She had tried dozens of times to connect with the child, using puppet therapy, drawing sessions, and gentle questioning techniques recommended by child psychologists. Each attempt had met with the same result. Emma's dark eyes would grow distant. Her small body would curl inward, as she would retreat into the silent world where she felt safe. "Hello, Emma," Santos said softly, her voice barely audible above the courthouse commotion. "Do you remember me?" "I'm Detective Santos." Emma looked at her briefly, then buried her face in Mr. Button's matted fur. The teddy bear had been a gift from her father, Carlos, on her second birthday back, when their biggest worry was whether Emma would eat her vegetables or take her afternoon nap. Rosa's eyes filled with tears as she watched her granddaughter's reaction. 6 months ago, Emma had been a chattering, laughing child who spoke in both Spanish and English, mixing languages with the delightful confusion of bilingual toddlers. She would sing along to her favorite cartoon songs, tell elaborate stories about imaginary friends, and pepper her family with endless questions about everything from why the sky was blue to where butterflies slept at night. Now Emma existed in a world of whispers and gestures, communicating only through nods, head shakes, and the occasional word spoken so quietly that even Rosa had to strain to hear. The child psychologist, Dr. Amanda Rivera, had explained that Emma's selective mutism was a common response to trauma, her young mind's way of protecting itself from memories too painful to process. But understanding the psychology didn't make it any easier for the family to bear. As they made their way through the courthouse corridors, Santos noticed how Emma's eyes darted nervously from person to person, as if searching for threats in every face. The detective had read Emma's medical reports, panic attacks that left the child gasping for breath, nightmares that woke her screaming in the middle of the night, and a regression in her developmental milestones that broke her family's heart. Daily, the prosecution team sat confidently at their table as families began filing into the gallery. District Attorney Rebecca Stone shuffled through her notes one final time, her red lipstick sharp as her reputation for securing convictions. She had built her career on cases like this tragic, but clear-cut situations where the evidence pointed in one direction. Stone barely glanced at Emma as the child entered the courtroom, viewing her only as a failed opportunity for testimony rather than a traumatized human being. Emma's eyes immediately found her father, Carlos Rodriguez, sitting at the defendant's table beside his overworked public defender, Michael Chun. Carlos had aged 10 years in the 6 months since his arrest. His once proud shoulders now slumped under the weight of false accusations, and his calloused hands that had built homes for other families, while struggling to provide for his own, trembled as he caught sight of his daughter. The construction worker had raised Emma alone since her mother, Isabella, died in a car accident when Emma was just 18 months old. Isabella had been Carlos's high school sweetheart, a nurse who dreamed of opening a community clinic in their family neighborhood. Her death had devastated Carlos, but Emma had become his reason to continue living, his motivation to work double shifts and weekend jobs to afford the medical treatments for her chronic asthma. That fateful Tuesday evening, Carlos had rushed to Martinez Pharmacy after Emma's nebulizer broke during one of her breathing attacks. The convenience store robbery at Garcia's Market next door had occurred while he waited for the prescription to be filled. Security footage showed him in the area, but the grainy images and unclear timestamps couldn't definitively place him inside either store at the crucial moment. Rosa squeezed Emma's hand as they took their seats in the gallery, directly behind the defense table where Carlos sat. The little girl stared at her father through the wooden barrier that might as well have been an ocean. Carlos turned slightly and mouthed, "I love you, Princesa," in Spanish, his eyes filling with tears he couldn't let fall in front of the jury. Emma clutched Mr. Buttons tighter, her small voice finally breaking the silence with a whisper so soft only Rosa could hear. "Daddy?" It was the first word she had spoken in 2 weeks, and it shattered Rosa's heart into a million pieces, knowing that her granddaughter still believed her father would come home, not understanding that today might be the last day they would see him as a free man. As Judge Patricia Thompson called the court to order, Emma Rodriguez sat quietly, holding within her silent mind the truth that could save her father, if only she could find the courage to speak it aloud. Carlos Rodriguez sat rigidly in the defendant's chair, his weathered hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had turned white. The Orange County jail jumpsuit had been replaced with a borrowed Navy suit that hung loose on his frame 20. Pounds lost during 6 months of sleepless nights and cafeteria food that tasted like cardboard. His dark eyes, once bright with laughter when he chased Emma around their small apartment, now held the hollow look of a man watching his world crumble brick by brick. Behind him, he could hear Emma's soft breathing as she fidgeted in the gallery, seat next to Rosa. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to scoop his daughter into his arms and run from this nightmare. But the metal shackles around his ankles served as a cold reminder that his freedom hung by the thinnest of threads. Public Defender Michael Chun sat beside him, frantically shuffling through a stack of papers that seemed to grow thinner with each passing hour, while the prosecution's table groaned under the weight of evidence boxes and confident smiles. The construction worker's mind drifted back to that Tuesday evening that had destroyed everything he held dear. Emma had been playing with her dolls in the living room when her breathing suddenly became labored, that terrifying wheeze that every parent of an asthmatic child learns to fear. Her nebulizer machine, the one Isabella had researched for weeks before they could afford it, had simply stopped working, its ancient motor finally giving up after 3 years of daily use. Carlos had scooped Emma into his arms, her small body shaking with each difficult breath, and rushed out into the Miami heat toward Martinez Pharmacy 6 blocks away. Mrs. Martinez, the elderly pharmacist who had filled Emma's prescriptions since she was born, stayed late that evening to help prepare the emergency medication. Carlos remembered pacing the pharmacy's narrow aisles while Emma sat on the counter, her legs swinging as Mrs. Martinez carefully measured the medication. "Daddy, why can't I breathe good?" Emma had asked in her mixture of Spanish and English, her voice barely a whisper between gasps. Carlos had kissed her forehead, tasting the salt of her frightened tears, and promised her that the medicine would make her feel better soon. It was the last conversation he'd had with his daughter before trauma stole her voice. The sound of police sirens had filled the air around 8:47 p.m., according to the pharmacy's security footage. Through the window, Carlos had seen flashing lights, reflecting off the buildings, but emergency vehicles were common in their neighborhood. He'd been focused entirely on Emma, watching her color slowly return to normal as the medication began working its magic. Mrs. Martinez had smiled and patted Emma's hand, telling her in Spanish that she was a brave little girl. It wasn't until they stepped outside 20 minutes later that Carlos realized the chaos next door at Garcia's Market. Police cars surrounded the convenience store, their red and blue lights painting the evening in urgent colors. Yellow tape fluttered in the warm breeze, and Detective Santos was already interviewing witnesses behind a patrol car. Carlos had felt sorry for whoever had been robbed, never imagining that within hours he would become the prime suspect. The arrest had come at 6 a.m. the following Thursday. Emma had been eating her breakfast cereal, carefully picking out the marshmallow pieces and arranging them in color-coded piles on her high-care tray, a morning ritual that never failed to make Carlos smile. The pounding on their apartment door had shattered that peaceful moment forever. Emma had started crying as armed officers flooded their small living room, their boots thundering across the worn carpet where she played every day. "Daddy!" she had screamed as they handcuffed Carlos, her small arms reaching for him as Rosa pulled her away from the chaos. It was the last clear word Emma would speak for months, her voice dying with the sight of her father being led away in chains while she stood helpless in her pajamas, clutching Mr. Buttons against her chest. Public Defender Chun leaned over and whispered urgently in Carlos's ear, but the words seemed to come from underwater. Something about plea bargains and reduced sentences, about the overwhelming evidence and the likelihood of conviction. Chun meant well, but he was handling 17 other cases this month, and Carlos could see the defeat in the young lawyer's eyes. A public defender's office was understaffed and underfunded, no match for District Attorney Stone's well-oiled conviction machine. Carlos thought about the letter he'd written to Emma the night before, folded and hidden in a cell beneath his thin mattress. He'd written dozens of letters over the past 6 months, letters explaining how much he loved her, letters promising that everything would be okay, letters apologizing for not being there to chase away her nightmares or read her bedtime stories. Rosa had forbidden him from sending them, believing they would only upset Emma further. But writing them was Carlos's only way of staying connected to his daughter. In the letters, he told Emma about the new playground they would visit when this nightmare ended, about the puppy they might adopt from the animal shelter, about the trip to Disney World he'd been saving for since her 2nd birthday. But with each passing day in jail, those dreams felt more like fantasies. The medical bills for Emma's asthma treatments continued to arrive, and Rosa's Social Security barely covered their basic expenses. Even if he was acquitted, they'd lost everything: their small savings, his job at the construction company, their sense of safety in the world. The worst part was watching Emma retreat further into herself with each supervised visit. During their last meeting, she hadn't spoken at all, just stared at him through the thick glass while tears ran down her cheeks. Rosa had tried to encourage conversation, but Emma only communicated through nods and gestures. Her bright personality dimmed to almost nothing. Carlos caught his daughter's reflection in the courtroom's polished wood paneling and felt his heart shatter all over again. Emma was wearing the little red dress Isabella had bought for her first birthday party, the one she'd been saving for special occasions. Rosa must have chosen it to make Emma feel pretty and confident, but to Carlos, it looked like a farewell outfit, something to remember his daughter by when this trial inevitably ended with his conviction. Judge Thompson's gavel echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, and Carlos Rodriguez straightened his shoulders, preparing to fight for the only thing that mattered in his world, the chance to be Emma's father again. District Attorney Rebecca Stone adjusted her designer glasses with manicured fingers, her sharp red nails catching the fluorescent courtroom lights like tiny daggers. At 42, she had built her formidable reputation on a foundation of high profile convictions, each guilty verdict another stepping stone toward her ultimate goal, the Florida Attorney General's office. The Rodriguez case would be her crown jewel, a perfect example of swift justice served to a community plagued by violent crime. Stone's corner office on the 15th floor of the State Attorney Building overlooked Biscayne Bay, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view that reminded her daily of how far she'd climbed from her modest beginnings in rural Georgia. Walls displayed her law degree from Harvard, photographs with senators and governors, and newspaper clippings with headlines like "Stone Delivers Justice" and "Prosecutor's Perfect Record Continues." She had worked 16-hour days for 20 years to earn this reputation, and no construction worker with a sob story would tarnish it now. Her briefcase sat open beside her at the prosecution table, revealing meticulously organized files that painted Carlos Rodriguez as a desperate man driven to violence by financial desperation. Stone had spent months building this case, interviewing witnesses, analyzing forensic evidence, and constructing a narrative so compelling that even she sometimes forgot the gaps that kept her awake at night. The truth was, the Rodriguez case wasn't as airtight as she pretended, but her career had taught her that confidence and presentation often mattered more than absolute certainty. The security footage from Garcia's market showed a masked figure of Rodriguez's approximate height and build entering the store at 8:43 p.m. The timestamp, however, was problematic. The camera's internal clock had been running 4 minutes slow. For months, something the store owner, Miguel Garcia, had never bothered to fix. This meant the robbery could have occurred anywhere between 8:39 and 8:47 p.m., overlapping with the time Rodriguez claimed to be at the pharmacy next door. Stone's star witness was the store clerk, 19-year-old Kevin Walsh, a college dropout, with a criminal record including petty theft and drug possession. Walsh claimed Rodriguez had demanded money while pointing a gun at his chest, but his initial police statement had been given 12 hours after the robbery, following a night of heavy drinking that he'd admitted to Detective Santos. Under cross-examination, Walsh had contradicted himself twice about which hand held the weapon and whether the robber had spoken with an accent. The most damaging evidence was the gunpowder residue found on Rodriguez's work jacket during his arrest. Stone's forensic expert, Dr. Patricia Nguyen, would testify that the residue pattern was consistent with firing a handgun within the previous 24 hours. What Stone wouldn't emphasize was that Rodriguez worked construction jobs that occasionally involved controlled demolitions, and his jacket had been processed through the courthouse evidence room before testing, a fact that defense attorney Chun seemed too overwhelmed to properly investigate. Stone glanced across the courtroom at little Emma Rodriguez, who sat clutching that pathetic teddy bear like a life preserver. The child's silence actually worked in Stone's favor. It eliminated the possibility of testimony that might contradict her carefully constructed timeline. Stone felt a fleeting moment of sympathy for the traumatized toddler, then pushed it aside with practiced efficiency. Emotions were luxuries that prosecutors couldn't afford, especially those with political ambitions. The district attorney's phone buzzed with a text from her campaign manager. Channel 7 wants interview after conviction. Governor's endorsement depends on this case. Stone smiled grimly, understanding the subtext. Her run for Attorney General required the backing of tough-on-crime politicians who demanded results, not excuses. A conviction in the Rodriguez case would demonstrate her ability to prosecute even sympathetic defendants when the evidence demanded it. Behind her confident facade, Stone harbored doubts that she shared with no one, not even her husband of 15 years. The timeline was tight, almost impossibly so. For Rodriguez to have committed the robbery, he would have needed to leave the pharmacy, run next door, commit the crime, and return to pick up his daughter's medication within a 7-minute window. The pharmacist, Mrs. Martinez, insisted that. Rodriguez never left her sight, but the elderly woman's vision was failing, and Stone's investigators had documented her confusion about the evening's events. The financial motive was compelling but circumstantial. Rodriguez's medical bills for Emma's asthma treatments totaled over $12,000 in unpaid debt, and his bank account showed a balance of $47 on the day of the robbery. Stone's team had interviewed his coworkers, who described him as increasingly desperate and stressed about money. But desperation didn't equal guilt, and Stone knew that dozens of other parents in the neighborhood faced similar financial pressures. Without turning to armed robbery, Stone's closing argument was already written, practiced in front of mirrors and focus groups until every pause and inflection was calculated for maximum impact. She would paint Rodriguez as a loving father whose good intentions were corrupted by impossible circumstances, a man who made a terrible choice that destroyed his family. The jury would see him not as a monster, but as a tragic figure whose actions demanded consequences, regardless of their sympathy for his situation. The prosecutor stood and smoothed her charcoal gray suit, the same outfit she'd worn for her last 3 high-profile victories. Her opening statement had been flawless, her witnesses credible, and her evidence presentation methodical and devastating. Public Defender Chun looked like a man drowning in paperwork and inadequate resources, exactly the kind of opponent Stone preferred. As Judge Thompson called for the next phase of testimony, Stone felt the familiar rush of courtroom adrenaline. This wasn't just about Carlos Rodriguez anymore. It was about her future, her reputation, and her unwavering belief that the system worked best when prosecutors like her made the hard choices that others couldn't stomach. The fact that a 3-year-old girl might lose her father forever was an unfortunate casualty of justice. But Stone had learned long ago that protecting society sometimes required breaking individual hearts. She opened her legal pad to fresh page and wrote at the top, "The People versus Carlos Rodriguez, Final Victory." The heavy oak doors of courtroom 6 swung open with a distinctive creak that had announced thousands of witnesses over the past 30 years. But this time, the entrance carried something different, a sense of anticipation that rippled through the gallery like electricity. Officer Jake Mitchell stepped through the doorway, his polished boots clicking against the marble floor with military precision, but all eyes immediately shifted to his 4-legged partner padding silently beside him. Rex was a magnificent golden retriever whose coat gleamed like burnished copper under the courtroom's harsh fluorescent lights. At 5 years old, he was in the prime of his career as an explosives detection specialist with the Miami-Dade Police Department. His dark, intelligent eyes surveyed the room with professional alertness, while his pink tongue hung out slightly. A small concession to the Florida heat that even the courthouse's aggressive air conditioning couldn't completely eliminate. Emma Rodriguez, who had been staring listlessly at her scuffed patent leather shoes, suddenly lifted her head as if awakened from a deep sleep. For 6 months, nothing had captured her attention for more than fleeting seconds. Not her favorite cartoons, not the colorful picture books Rosa read to her each night, not even the ice cream truck that played its tinkling melody outside their apartment window. But Rex was different. Something in his gentle demeanor and noble bearing spoke to a part of Emma's spirit that trauma hadn't been able to touch. Officer Mitchell had been dreading this testimony since receiving his subpoena. 2 weeks earlier, a 12-year veteran of the force, he'd testified in dozens of cases, but never had he felt the weight of a family's future pressing so heavily on his shoulders. Mitchell knew that his partner's nose had detected gunpowder residue on Carlos Rodriguez's work jacket, but he also knew that Rex was trained to alert on explosives, not firearms residue. The overlap in chemical signatures meant Rex's reaction could indicate several different substances, a nuance that prosecution and defense attorneys often overlooked in their rush to present dramatic evidence. Rex had been Mitchell's partner for 3 years, ever since the officer transferred from narcotics to the explosives unit, following a traumatic undercover operation that still haunted his dreams. The dog had literally saved his life, twice, once detecting a bomb in an abandoned warehouse where Mitchell was pursuing a suspect, and another time alerting to explosive materials that a disturbed teenager had brought to a high school. Rex wasn't just a work partner. He was Mitchell's closest friend and most trusted confidant. As they approached the witness stand, Rex's behavior began to change in subtle ways that only Mitchell could detect. The dog's ears, normally relaxed and floppy, became slightly more erect. His nose, constantly working to process the thousands of scents that humans couldn't perceive, started twitching more rapidly. Rex's training included extensive socialization to courthouse environments, so the formal setting shouldn't have affected him. But something was clearly capturing his attention. Judge Thompson, a dog owner herself, smiled slightly as Rex settled beside the witness chair. The 70-year-old judge had presided over countless cases during her 25 years on the bench, but she'd never lost her appreciation for the working animals that served alongside law enforcement. Her own German Shepherd Duke had been a retired police dog who spent his golden years chasing tennis balls in her backyard. Emma's transformation was immediate and remarkable. The little girl who had been practically catatonic since entering the courthouse suddenly sat up straighter, her dark eyes following Rex's every movement with an intensity that made Rose's heart skip. Emma's hands, which had been clutching Mr. Buttons in a death grip, loosened slightly as she leaned forward in her seat. For the first time in months, her face showed genuine interest rather than hollow resignation. District Attorney Stone noticed Emma's reaction with a mixture of annoyance and calculation. She had counted on the child remaining invisible throughout the proceedings, a tragic but silent reminder of why Carlos Rodriguez deserved conviction. Emma's sudden animation threatened to humanize the defendant in ways that could affect the jury's perception of her carefully constructed case. Rex's head turned toward the gallery, his intelligent eyes scanning the faces of spectators with methodical thoroughness. His training had taught him to identify specific scents in crowded environments, filtering through layers of perfume, cologne, cleaning products, and human sweat to detect the particular chemical signatures he'd been taught to recognize. Something in this room was triggering responses that didn't quite match his usual protocols. Mitchell began his testimony, explaining Rex's extensive training at the Canine Academy in Alabama, where dogs learn to detect over 30 different types of explosive materials and chemical compounds. The partnership between human and dog required absolute trust Mitchell had to rely on. Rex's superior senses, while Rex depended on Mitchell's ability to interpret and act on his alerts. Rex has successfully identified explosive materials in over 200 cases, Mitchell testified, his voice steady despite his growing uneasiness about his partner's unusual behavior. His accuracy rate exceeds 98%, and he's never given a false positive alert for gunpowder residue. But as Mitchell spoke, Rex continued to exhibit signs of agitation that had nothing to do with the evidence they were supposed to be presenting. The dog's attention kept drifting from Carlos Rodriguez to other areas of the courtroom, his nose working overtime as if trying to solve a puzzle that his human partner couldn't understand. Emma whispered something so softly that even Rosa, sitting inches away, couldn't hear the words. It was the first sound Emma had made since entering the courthouse, and it caused several heads to turn in their direction. The little girl's eyes remained fixed on Rex, who seemed to sense her attention and turned his magnificent head toward her. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, child and dog regarded each other across the formal divide of the courtroom. Emma's lips moved again, forming words that carried no sound, while Rex's tail gave the slightest wag, a sign of recognition that something important was happening. Officer Mitchell felt his partner's energy shift, and a chill ran down his spine. As he realized that Rex wasn't just detecting evidence anymore, he was reacting to something else entirely, something that could change everything. Rex's behavior became increasingly erratic as Officer Mitchell continued his testimony about the gunpowder residue discovery. The golden retriever, normally a model of discipline during court proceedings, began shifting his weight from paw to paw in an anxious dance that sent ripples of confusion through the courtroom. His breathing quickened, and a low whimper escaped his throat, a sound so unusual that several jurors leaned forward in their seats, momentarily forgetting the human drama unfolding before them. Mitchell paused mid-sentence, his trained eye catching every nuance of his partner's distress. In 3 years of working together, he had never seen Rex exhibit such conflicted behavior in a controlled environment. The dog's nose worked frantically, nostrils flaring as he processed scents that seemed to overwhelm his finely tuned sensory system. Something in this sterile courtroom was triggering responses that had nothing to do with the evidence they were supposed to be presenting. "Is your dog all right, Officer Mitchell?" Judge Thompson inquired, her maternal instincts activated by Rex's obvious distress. She had seen enough police dogs in her courtroom to recognize when something was amiss, and Rex's behavior was far from normal protocol. "I'm not sure, Your Honor," Mitchell admitted, his voice betraying a concern that made District Attorney Stone shift uncomfortably in her chair. This was not part of her carefully orchestrated presentation. Rex is responding to something, but it's not following his usual pattern for explosive detection. Emma Rodriguez watched this exchange with growing fascination, her small hands pressed against the wooden gallery railing as she strained to get closer to the agitated dog. For the first time since that terrible night 6 months ago, something had captured her complete attention, piercing through the fog of trauma that had enveloped her young mind. Her dark eyes sparkled with an alertness that Rosa hadn't seen since before the robbery, and tears of hope began to form in the elderly woman's eyes. Rex suddenly stood up, his powerful haunches propelling him forward despite Mitchell's gentle restraint on the leash. The dog's attention fixed on something beyond the witness stand, beyond the prosecution table, beyond the neat rows of evidence boxes that Stone had arranged with such precision. His tail, which had been tucked between his legs in confusion, began to wag tentatively as if he were recognizing a familiar scent, but couldn't quite place its source. The courtroom fell silent as Rex began to pace in a tight circle, his training warring with instincts that demanded action. Mitchell could feel the tension radiating from his partner through the leather leash, and for the first time in his career, he wondered if he truly understood the dog that had become his most trusted ally. "Your Honor, perhaps we should take a brief recess," suggested Public Defender Chun, sensing an opportunity in the unexpected disruption. His client's fate hung in the balance, and any deviation from Stone's carefully planned presentation might create reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. But Stone was having none of it. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness was in the middle of crucial testimony about evidence handling procedures. Officer Mitchell's dog's behavior, while unusual, has no bearing on the facts of this case." Rex's whimpering grew louder, more insistent, as if he were trying to communicate something urgent that his human companions couldn't understand. The sound cut through Stone's objection like a knife, drawing every eye in the courtroom to the magnificent animal who seemed to be fighting an internal battle between training and instinct. Emma suddenly pushed herself up to stand on her seat, her small frame barely tall enough to see over the adults in front of her. Rosa reached out to steady her granddaughter, but something in the child's posture, a determination that hadn't been there for months, made her pause. Emma's lips moved, silently, as if she were trying to form words that had been locked away too long to come easily. The court reporter, Harold Ewing, shifted nervously at his stenographic machine, his fingers frozen over the keys as he watched the unexpected drama unfold. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the courthouse's aggressive air conditioning, and his usual professional composure seemed to crack slightly as Rex's agitation continued to build. He had been working in this courthouse for 18 months, recording thousands of testimonies with mechanical precision, but something about this particular case made his hands tremble. Mitchell made a decision that would later change everything. Instead of forcing Rex to sit and continue the testimony, he loosened his grip on the leash slightly, allowing his partner to follow his instincts within the confines of the courtroom. The dog immediately began moving toward the gallery area, his nose high in the air as he tracked whatever scent had captured his attention so completely. Rex's path took him past the defense table, where Carlos Rodriguez watched with growing amazement. The construction worker had always loved animals. He'd promised Emma they would get a puppy when their financial situation improved, and he could see that this dog was trying to communicate something important. Carlos felt a flutter of hope. In his chest, the first positive emotion he'd experienced since his arrest. A golden retriever continued his methodical sweep of the courtroom, pausing occasionally to test the air with deep, analytical breaths. His training had taught him to be systematic in his searches, to never rush or make assumptions. But whatever he was detecting seemed to be moving or changing, making it difficult to pinpoint the source. Judge Thompson watched this unprecedented scene with growing fascination. In 25 years on the bench, she had seen surprise witnesses, dramatic confessions, and last-minute evidence revelations, but she had never seen a police dog conduct what appeared to be an independent investigation. In the middle of a trial, Emma's voice, when it finally came, was so soft that only Rosa could hear it at first. "Pretty doggy," she whispered, her first clear words in weeks. Then, louder, with growing confidence, "Pretty doggy helping daddy." The courtroom held its collective breath as Rex suddenly stopped his pacing and turned to look directly at Emma. Rodriguez. Child and dog regarded each other across the formal divide of the courtroom, and something passed between them, a recognition, an understanding, a shared knowledge that would soon turn this trial upside down. The moment arrived with the sudden clarity of lightning splitting a stormy sky. Emma Rodriguez, who had been standing on her seat watching Rex's methodical investigation, suddenly thrust her small arm forward with shocking determination. Her tiny finger, still dimpled with baby fat, pointed directly at the magnificent golden retriever who had stopped his pacing to look at her with intelligent brown eyes. "Good doggy." Emma's voice rang out across the hushed courtroom, clear as a church bell and twice as powerful. The words shattered 6 months of silence, 6 months of trauma-induced mutism, 6 months of a family's desperate hope that their little girl would find her voice again. Rosa gasped so loudly that several jurors turned to look, tears already streaming down the grandmother's weathered cheeks. But Emma wasn't finished. The dam of silence had burst completely, and words poured out of her like water from a broken levee. Her small voice grew stronger, more confident, as if each syllable was reclaiming territory that trauma had stolen from her developing mind. "Good doggy found the bad man," she continued, her finger now moving past Rex with deliberate precision. The courtroom followed her gaze like spectators at a tennis match, heads turning in unison, to see where the child's accusation would land. Emma's arm extended toward the court reporter's desk, where Harold Ewing sat frozen behind his stenographic machine like a deer caught in headlights. The transformation in Ewing was immediate and damning. His face, normally pale from years of indoor work, turned ashen white, then flushed crimson as every eye in the courtroom fixed on him. The professional mask he'd worn for 18 months of court reporting cracked like old paint, revealing something desperate and cornered beneath. His hands, which had been trembling slightly throughout the morning's proceedings, now shook so violently that he knocked over his water glass, sending liquid cascading across his transcription equipment. Bad man hurt my gaddy." Emma's voice rose to a near shout, her words carrying the fury of a child who had been forced into silence but would be silent no more. She began speaking rapidly in a mixture of English and Spanish, her bilingual mind finally free to express the horrors she had witnessed that terrible night 6 months ago. Rex's reaction was immediate and definitive. The golden retriever, who had been searching for the source of a scent that had been driving him to distraction, suddenly found his target. His training kicked in with military precision as he began, barking not the excited yipping of a pet, but the sharp, urgent alerts of a working dog who had detected exactly what he'd been trained to find. His powerful body strained against Mitchell's leash as he pulled toward Ewing with undeniable purpose. Officer Mitchell, stunned by the sudden turn of events, felt his partner's certainty through the leather lead. Rex was exhibiting classic detection behavior, the same posture and intensity he showed when alerting to explosive materials. But this time, he wasn't alerting to evidence that had been planted on Carlos Rodriguez. He was alerting to the actual source of the gunpowder residue, the person who had handled weapons, recently enough to still carry the chemical signature on his clothing and skin. Harold Ewing bolted from his chair like a man on fire, his expensive court reporter's equipment crashing to the floor in a cacophony of metal and plastic. The stenographic machine that had faithfully recorded thousands of testimonies scattered its keys across the marble floor like scattered teeth. Ewing's usually neat appearance, pressed shirt, conservative tie, polished shoes, became disheveled as panic took control of his movements. "She's just a confused child," Ewing shouted desperately as he backed toward the courtroom's rear exit, his voice cracking with fear. "She doesn't know what she's saying? Post-traumatic stress. Children make things up." But Emma was far from confused. 6 months of enforced silence had given her young mind time to process every detail of that horrific night. And now the memories poured out in a torrent of accusation and recognition. She pointed at Ewing with both hands, now her small body trembling with the effort of finally speaking the truth that had been trapped inside her. He had the gun. He wore the mask. He made Daddy scared. Emma's words came faster now, tumbling over each other in her urgency to be believed. Daddy was buying my medicine. The bad man was hurting the nice store man. District Attorney Stone watched her carefully constructed case implode in real time, her prosecutorial instincts warring with her political ambitions. The evidence she had presented so confidently, the gunpowder residue, the timeline, the circumstantial connections suddenly took on an entirely different meaning. If Ewing was the real perpetrator, if he had been involved in planting evidence while working within the courthouse system itself, then Stone's reputation would be damaged beyond repair. Carlos Rodriguez rose from his chair at the defendant's table, tears streaming down his face as he heard his daughter's voice for the first time in months. The man who had been prepared to accept 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit watched his 3-year-old daughter become his salvation. Emma's words were more powerful than any defense attorney's argument, more convincing than any expert witness testimony. Judge Thompson pounded her gavel repeatedly, trying to restore order as chaos erupted throughout the courtroom. Bailiffs moved toward Ewing, who continued his desperate retreat toward the exit. Reporters in the gallery reached for their phones and notepads, recognizing that they were witnessing a story that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. Rex continued his urgent barking, HIA alerts providing scientific confirmation of what Emma's broken silence had revealed. The dog's nose didn't lie. Harold Ewing carried the chemical signature of recent gunpowder exposure, not from handling evidence, but from firing the weapon that had destroyed the Rodriguez family's peaceful life. Emma's final words before the courtroom descended into complete chaos would be replayed on news broadcasts across the nation. Daddy didn't do the bad thing. The bad man did the bad thing to Daddy. The truth had found its voice in the smallest witness of all. Harold Ewing made it exactly 17 feet before bailiff Marcus Johnson tackled him to the marble floor with the precision of a former college linebacker. The sound of Ewing's body hitting the ground echoed through the courthouse like a gunshot, punctuating the end of 18 months of deception and the beginning of true justice for the Rodriguez family. Papers from his briefcase scattered across the floor like confetti, revealing documents that would later prove to be crucial evidence of his financial desperation and criminal planning. Let me go. This is insane. You're believing the fantasies of a traumatized child. Ewing screamed as Johnson efficiently applied handcuffs, his professional court reporter's vocabulary dissolving into the desperate pleadings of a cornered criminal. His carefully maintained facade of respectability crumbled completely as spittle flew from his mouth and his expensive tie twisted around his neck during the struggle. Emma Rodriguez ran from her grandmother's arms straight to her father, her small legs carrying her over the wooden barrier that had separated them for 6 agonizing months. Carlos caught his daughter in his arms, lifting her against his chest as she babbled excitedly in both Spanish and English, her words tumbling over each other in her urgency to tell him everything she had been unable to say. Papi, the bad man, wore a black mask like Halloween, but scary. He pointed the gun at Mr. Garcia and said, "Give me money or I hurt people. You were buying my breathing medicine from Mrs. Martinez, and you didn't know the bad man was there." Emma's words poured out like a dam had burst, her small hands patting her father's tear-stained cheeks as if to make sure he was real. Detective Maria Santos moved swiftly into action, her 20 years of experience kicking in as she began connecting dots that had been invisible just minutes before. She approached the scattered contents of Ewing's briefcase with latex gloves, immediately spotting betting slips from illegal gambling operations, past due notices from loan sharks, and bank statements showing a man drowning in debt despite his steady courthouse salary. "Judge Thompson, I need to halt these proceedings immediately," Santos announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had just cracked a case wide open. "We have probable cause to believe that evidence in this case has been systematically compromised by someone with access to the courthouse evidence room." Rex continued his alert behavior even after Ewing's capture, his nose leading him to the scattered papers on the floor. Officer Mitchell watched in amazement as his partner identified specific documents that carried the same chemical signature he had been detecting all morning, the lingering scent of gunpowder that had nothing to do with Carlos Rodriguez's construction work and everything to do with the real perpetrator's recent criminal activities. District Attorney Rebecca Stone stood frozen at her prosecution table, watching her carefully constructed career ambitions collapse in real time. The evidence she had presented so confidently, the gunpowder residue on Rodriguez's jacket, the timeline placing him at the scene, the financial motive now pointed directly to courthouse corruption that had occurred under her nose. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls from reporters and political allies, but she couldn't bring herself to answer them. Public Defender Michael Chun, who had been struggling with inadequate resources and overwhelming caseloads, suddenly found himself in the middle of the biggest legal scandal in Miami-Dade County history. His client, whom he had privately believed might actually be guilty despite his vigorous defense, was clearly the victim of an elaborate frame-up orchestrated by someone within the justice system itself. "Your Honor," Sean said, his voice shaking. With indignation, "I move for immediate dismissal of all charges against my client and demand a full investigation into evidence tampering and prosecutorial misconduct." Judge Thompson, her usually composed demeanor shattered by the unprecedented events unfolding in her courtroom, called for an immediate recess while she processed the implications of what had just occurred. In 25 years on the bench, she had never witnessed such a dramatic reversal of fortune or such clear evidence of systemic corruption. Emma continued her rapid-fire explanation to anyone who would listen, her young mind finally free to process the trauma that had held her. Voice captive for so long. "The bad man came to our house after. He pretended to be nice, but he smelled like the scary place. He touched Daddy's work jacket when nobody was looking. I wanted to tell, but the words wouldn't come out." Rosa Rodriguez wept openly as she listened to her granddaughter's account, understanding for the first time the full extent of the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed their family. Emma's selective mutism hadn't been just trauma from witnessing the robbery. It had been her young mind's way of protecting a secret too dangerous and complex for a 3-year-old to process and communicate. Detective Santos coordinated with courthouse security to review surveillance footage from the evidence storage areas, already suspecting what they would find. Ewing's access card had been used multiple times during off hours, always coinciding with high-profile cases where evidence needed to be processed for court presentation. The scope of his corruption was beginning to emerge, and Rodriguez was clearly not his first victim. The courtroom gradually emptied as news crews gathered outside and courthouse officials began damage control procedures. But in the center of the chaos, Carlos Rodriguez held his daughter tightly, listening to her voice clear, strong, and truthful as she recounted the nightmare that had nearly sent an innocent man to prison for 20 years. "Daddy, I was scared the bad man would hurt you more if I told," Emma whispered against his neck. "But the pretty doggy helped me be brave." Rex, still alert but calmer, now that his mission was complete, received pats and praise from his handler, while continuing to guard the evidence that would eventually send Harold Ewing to prison for armed robbery, evidence tampering, perjury, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The truth had finally exploded into the light, carried on the voice of a 3-year-old girl who had found the courage to speak when it mattered most. 1 year later, the Miami courthouse looked exactly the same from the outside, but everything had changed within its marble walls. The afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the steps, where Carlos Rodriguez stood with his daughter Emma, now 4 years old, and chattering excitedly about the butterflies dancing around the courthouse garden. The same building that had nearly destroyed their family had become the symbol of their redemption, and the birthplace of sweeping reforms that would protect countless other families from similar injustices. Emma wore a bright yellow sundress that matched her radiant smile, a stark contrast to the somber red dress she had worn during those dark days when her voice was trapped by trauma. Her hair bounced in pigtails as she ran through the carefully manicured garden, chasing the monarch butterflies that had recently emerged from their cocoons, a metaphor that wasn't lost on her father, who watched her with eyes that still sometimes filled with tears of gratitude. "Daddy, look. The pretty flowers are the same colors as Rex," Emma called out, pointing to the golden marigolds that the courthouse gardener had planted in honor of the heroic golden retriever who had changed their lives forever. The Rex Memorial Garden had been dedicated 3 months earlier, after the beloved police dog had passed away peacefully in his sleep at the impressive age of 6, having lived a full life of service that culminated in his greatest achievement, saving an innocent family. Carlos, now 32, but looking younger than he had in years, smiled as he watched his daughter's unbridled joy. The construction worker had transformed into something he never expected to become: the head of security for the Miami-Dade court system, a position created specifically for him after his wrongful conviction exposed systemic vulnerabilities that demanded immediate attention. His intimate knowledge of how evidence could be manipulated, combined with his unwavering integrity, made him uniquely qualified to ensure that no other family would suffer as his had. The financial settlement from his wrongful imprisonment lawsuit had been substantial enough to pay off Emma's medical bills, buy a modest house in a safe neighborhood with a fenced backyard perfect for the golden retriever puppy they had adopted from the same program that had trained Rex. Emma had named the puppy Justice, and the young dog was already showing signs of the intelligence and loyalty that characterized his predecessor. Rosa Rodriguez, now 70, sat on a bench in the garden, her arthritis much improved since the stress of her son's legal troubles had ended. She spent her days teaching Emma traditional Puerto Rican recipes and stories, watching her granddaughter blossom into a confident, articulate child whose bilingual abilities impressed everyone she met. The trauma had left Emma stronger in many ways, with an unusual empathy for others and an uncanny ability to sense when people were troubled or afraid. Detective Maria Santos, promoted to lieutenant following her exemplary handling of the evidence tampering scandal, visited the courthouse regularly to check on the Rodriguez family and to oversee the implementation of new protocols that she had helped design. The Emma protocol required that all evidence handling be recorded by multiple cameras and witnessed by at least 2 officers, while the Rex standard mandated that all canine alerts be immediately investigated by independent teams. To prevent manipulation, Harold Ewing was serving a 35-year sentence in Florida State Prison for armed robbery, evidence tampering, perjury, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and 5 additional robberies that investigators discovered during their review of his 18-month courthouse employment. His gambling addiction and cocaine dependency had driven him to increasingly desperate measures, with the Rodriguez frame-up being his most elaborate and nearly successful scheme. The other families whose loved ones had been wrongfully convicted based on his manipulated evidence were also receiving justice through overturned convictions and substantial settlements. Officer Jake Mitchell, who had retired from active duty following Rex's death, worked as a consultant training new K-9 teams across Florida. He visited the courthouse monthly to share Rex's story with new officers, emphasizing the importance of trusting their K-9 partners even when the evidence seemed to point in a different direction. Rex's uncanny ability to detect the truth beyond the fabricated evidence had become legendary in law enforcement circles, inspiring a new generation of handlers to develop deeper bonds with their 4-legged partners. District Attorney Rebecca Stone's political career had ended abruptly when the evidence tampering scandal broke. She now worked as a public defender in rural Georgia, her hometown, having discovered a passion for protecting the innocent that she had lost somewhere along her ambitious climb to power. The experience had humbled her profoundly, and she often spoke at law schools about the dangers of prioritizing convictions over truth. Emma ran back to her father, slightly out of breath from chasing butterflies, her cheeks flushed with happiness. "Daddy, when justice gets bigger, can he come visit the courthouse like Rex did? Can he help other families like Rex helped us?" Carlos knelt down to his daughter's eye level, the same position Detective Santos had taken during those desperate months when Emma's voice was locked away. "Maybe he can, Princessa. But you know what? You already helped more families than any dog ever could." Emma tilted her head with curiosity, her dark eyes sparkling with intelligence. "How did I help families, Daddy?" "By being brave enough to speak the truth when it mattered most," Carlos explained, smoothing her hair with gentle fingers. "Your voice saved not just our family, but lots of other families too. The new rules they made, because of you, will protect children and mommies and daddies for many, many years. As they prepared to leave the courthouse garden, Emma looked back at the building one final time. The imposing structure that had once terrified her now seemed friendly and welcoming, its windows reflecting the late afternoon sun like golden eyes watching over the community it served. "Daddy," Emma said with the profound wisdom that sometimes emerges from the mouths of children, "justice isn't scary anymore, is it?" Carlos took his daughter's small hand in his own, feeling the strength that trauma had forged in her young spirit. "No, Mia. Justice isn't scary when good people make. Sure, it tells the truth,